Here we go. The SEC Insider Hit this morning is brought to you by Pearl River Resort, Golden Moon Casino, Dancing Rabbit Golf Club. Also presented by RPT and Rick's Pro Truck, the #1 Jeep truck accessory stores in Mississippi. New location in Gluckstadt, RPT, ricksprotruck.com. Let's see, spraying bedliners, lift kits, WeatherTech floor guards, you name it, they got it. Heck, football season's around the corner, and so is hunting season. We are live in the Bank Plus studio. You're listening to ESPN 105.9 The Zone. You can watch the show on YouTube right now. Search Out of Bounds Sports. Go to YouTube. We hope you'll subscribe to our channel. And you can watch the show right now on YouTube. Search Out of Bounds Sports. We're going to go to the Miller Lite guest line. Welcome in 247sports, genespage.com. He is Steve Robertson, HailState Insider. There's a lot going on in the league today. Players report, go through all this protocol, COVID-19, get ready for voluntary workouts. Coaches are finally back, players back. You know, we're going to play football in the fall in the SEC. We hope on time. We'll see how that all shakes out. Also, a big story the last few weeks has been the transfer portal and two Mississippi State players leaving, Darian Jones and Fabien Lovett. At times we thought that Ole Miss would be the destination. That's not the case. Lovett to Florida State. I haven't seen anything official on Jones, so we bring in Steve Robertson. Steve, walk us through the Darian Jones, Fabien Lovett deal, and what's the latest and what you've heard?
Well, as you know, late last week there was, some chatter kind of began to get out there that, Ole Miss officials had done their own due diligence and apparently did not have a comfort level with bringing those two players in. What they uncovered, I guess, is something that they can discuss. But, that was I would say a week ago, it was pretty much a done deal that both of those guys were headed to Ole Miss. And then over the course of the week, there was some reluctance, it appeared, for them to announce either of these players as signees. That's one of the things I talked about on my own show, is that why hadn't they announced them? And then the talking point gets around, well, they're dotting I's and crossing T's. Well, apparently somebody lost their pen, because that's no longer the case. And it doesn't appear that either will be headed to Oxford. As a matter of fact, our Florida State site reporting that Fabien Lovett was in Tallahassee over the weekend in anticipation of today's reporting date. So, again, nothing's still official on Darian Jones, but it does appear at this point, and I think it's safe to say, too, give Ole Miss officials some credit here, for doing the due diligence here and ensuring they didn't put the university in harm's way. And the thing that I get back to, Bo, over and over and over again, let the coaches handle recruiting. Let the coaches handle it, because when third parties get involved, that's when things kind of go awry.
And had it been handled the right way, Darian Jones would be an Ole Miss Rebel today. You agree or disagree?
No doubt about that, Bo. There's absolutely 100%. 100%. If you just let things take the natural progression, let things resolve itself of its own volition, let a guy go in the portal, recruit him, not to mention a lot of natural advantages. It's an in-state school. Not to mention you've got Terrell Buckley, who was incredibly close with Darian Jones. I think if people had just kind of sit back and just kind of let things progress naturally, he'd be reporting at Ole Miss today. I don't think there'd be any question, and there wouldn't be any concern or any aggravation or angst. I mean, sure that you'd have the natural aspect of the rivalry, but we wouldn't be having this conversation today had things just been handled the right way.
So I guess the Fabien Lovett connection, Steve, is the fact that Norvell was right there in the backyard of DeSoto County, very aware of Lovett as a player. They weren't going to land him at a Memphis-type program because it was MSU, Ole Miss, whatever, Florida, some other schools. But that was kind of a natural landing spot, too, because they were more than familiar with Fabien Lovett as a player in high school, Steve?
Yeah, that's a big part of it. And then Andre Woodson's down there, too. Andre Woodson's the guy that recruited both of those guys when he was at Auburn. And so there's twofold relationships. There's Norvell having a long-time relationship with the staff at Olive Branch and has recruited several players from there. And then Woodson's a guy that was very familiar with Lovett when he was trying to get him to go to Auburn. And so that's really where it all kind of happened. They handle things the right way, and then they get the kid. And I think it's a good situation for Lovett. I mean, Fabien last year kind of thrown to the wolves as a redshirt freshman, started every game. And, probably before he was a little bit ready because of some mismanagement of the roster before him, I don't know that if he's a difference maker type guy, but I think that he's certainly a guy that can go down there at Florida State and be a guy that produces. I think he has a real chance to go in there. I don't know that he plays this year, but I think he has a real chance to go in there and be a depth guy early and probably be a starter within a couple of years at Florida State.
Okay. Steve Robertson, HailState Insider, genespage.com on the Miller Lite guest line. You can watch the show on YouTube, search Out of Bounds Sports. Fabien Lovett was a Mississippi State D lineman. He's now at Florida State. We'll see where Darian Jones lands. Where do you think Jones will end up, Steve, in the next few days?
Well, if I had to call it today, I would say Florida State. That's where things appear to be trending. I actually reached out to Chris Nee of our Florida State site last night just to kind of compare some notes with him. We weren't able to connect, but I think that's probably the most likely destination right now. But this thing has proven to be so unpredictable, but I wouldn't be the least bit surprised to see somebody else emerge as a contender here in the final hours.
Man, so you go from a 4-hour round trip, 2 hours up to Oxford, 2.5, whatever, 5-hour round trip to Oxford to an 18-hour round trip for the parents. Unbelievable. Out of Bounds, ESPN 105.9 The Zone. Steve Robertson on the Miller Lite guest line. Steve, you wrote a piece on Gene's page. Can you give us a cliff notes for the listeners of what starts today as far as protocol and tests and blah, 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 leading up to voluntary workouts next Monday for the MSU players and many SEC athletes around the league?
Yeah, I think it's going to be pretty commonplace for everybody. Everybody will kind of report for screening and testing, and it'll be staged out, so you don't have, this big herd of players all at once. And then, I spoke with a couple people yesterday to kind of get some idea of, what's going to happen on a day-to-day basis. And so the guys are going to come in, they're going to have their temperature taken every day. They're going to be in contact with the medical staff, and they're going to be observed by them every single day. They're going to fill out a form talking about any potential symptoms. If a guy is running a fever, he will be assessed further, and if other testing is required, they'll do that. But everybody's going to be tested initially, and then from that point forward, anybody that's symptomatic will be tested. But they're going to do some other things too that I think are, probably something should have been doing all along, is that you're going to have somebody come in as a smaller group. They're going to have the workstation spread out a little bit more. It's all going to be kind of an appointment-only deal. And then as soon as that work group is finished, they'll go get their post-workout nutrition, and then there'll be support staffers that are going to go in and completely sanitize the weight room. The stuff that was utilized and not utilized, everything's going to be wiped down completely. So when the next group comes in, they come into a sanitized environment. And so I'm sure some of that was already happening due to MRSA and other things of that nature, but it's going to be a much more involved process these days to ensure that nobody gets sick. And one of the things I think is interesting, too, is that if there is a player that tests positive, we may not know it because of HIPAA, and if there is a player that does test positive, they're not going to release that information publicly, obviously, to protect the player. And so I know that's the big fear for everybody right now is, okay, we're ramping back up. But what happens nationally the first time there's some kids that test positive? What if somebody gets sick? Does that derail college football again? What do we do? Do we quarantine those guys? All that's still being kind of worked out. But as it stands today, Mississippi State and just about every other school in the SEC is going to have players report and begin taking those first steps towards college football fall.
I would have to believe maybe the most excited player today would be KJ Costello. He's walking into a place that he knows is going to sling it. Nothing against Stanford. They're well coached, Steve, but they don't run the air raid. And you could argue maybe it's a little bit of a conservative offense. Would you agree that maybe KJ Costello is the most fired up guy in the football facility this morning?
Yeah, I think he should be. And he got here over the weekend. He and I connected last week, and he said he'd be arriving on Saturday. And yeah, he's the guy too that he is very familiar with the Mike Leach offense because he sat there and watched it from the sidelines at Stanford when Washington State beat him. And so I'm sure every quarterback is somewhat envious of the fact that he's going to be able to throw it. 40, 50, potentially 60 times a game. This is a guy, too, that is trying to elevate his professional stock. Now, when I spoke to him, he kind of downplayed that aspect of it. He goes, man, I got another year to play college football. I got a year to go play in the SEC against some of the best defenses in the country. And as a competitor, he's very excited about that. But you also got to think, too, when you look at what Mike Leach did for Gardner Minshew, and obviously KJ Costello's coming in with a little bit better curve. Minshew was a guy that hadn't done a whole lot on the college level, but you get a guy like KJ Costello who's been a former all Pac-12 guy, a guy that has got about 6,200 yards and 49 touchdowns under his belt. He's going to be able to come in here and let it go. And I know that he was eager to get here and kind of get on the practice field with his receivers to start throwing football around. And so, yeah, I suspect you'll see him kind of jump in and kind of be leading the charge a little bit. But I agree with your assessment. I think he's one of those guys that probably has a little bit of a chip on his shoulder. After the way things ended at Stanford, he gets banged up and moves on for another opportunity. But I think that he's a guy that feels like he has something to prove, and Mike Leach will certainly give him the platform to do it.
We just had a text from a listener, Steve Robertson, genespage.com, 247 Sports on the Miller Lite guest line. Steve, with Fabien Lovett leaving, what does the interior defensive line look like, starters, and maybe one or two guys behind them? And also, Steve, this is a little bit different deal with Arnett going with a 3-3-5, right?
Yeah, it is. And so you're not going to have the two down D tackles. Nathan Pickering obviously is the guy that we expect to get a lot of snaps. Alan Love is the guy that'll take Lovett's spot in the rotation. But, the alignment's going to be a lot different, so you're not quite as dependent on those interior guys that perhaps you were in the 4-3. It's going to be a little different deal. But, yeah, I mean, and here's the thing lost in all this, and a lot of people get caught up in all the rah-rah stuff of the rivalry. I mean, the bottom line is State's lost two deepers on defense.
Mm-hmm.
And there's no way you can feel good about that. Now, granted, you get some guys that are going to be able to kind of plug and play, but that's a lot of SEC snaps walking out the door. And so to think that it's not a big deal, it's a little bit short-sighted. But I think, Fabian's a guy that was probably in a position to go back and start this year, but there's not going to be quite as many defensive tackle reps per se. I think you're going to have guys like Jordan Davis and Trey Lawson that are going to be out there and lining up outside in that two-point stance, kind of getting after the quarterback. So it'll be philosophically a lot different. But to try to explain away the fact that you're losing those guys is a positive thing. It's just not true.
No. Blake, you got a question for Steve?
Yeah, Steve, I want to go to exactly kind of what you said about losing Jory and Jones and looking at a 3-3-5 where you're going to play 5 defensive backs. Mississippi State offensively is set up to be a running offense in theory. We're going to see a change and a transition on that side of the ball. That's been talked about. What hasn't been talked about is that Mississippi State defensively is really set up to be a 6-man front, even a 7-man front at times in the front end because of the guys they bring in on the defensive line and then at the linebacker position. How difficult will it be for Mississippi State to keep healthy, fresh-legged guys in the secondary all season long if you're going to be running 5 and even potentially 6-man defensive backs secondaries like that?
Well, you've run a nickel defense the last 2 years too, and so you lose Aquarius Landrews and Brian Cole and those guys, but those guys are used to playing a lot with 5 DBs mainly on the field, and so that aspect of it I think is okay. I mean, I don't know how much of that really changes in the alignment. I think it really impacts the front 7 more so than the back group, but yeah, it's a depth concern. I mean, you got Jerry and Jones. He started 1 game last year, but he played in 11 and played hurt a lot of times. So this is a guy that was a valuable part of the 2 deep, and now you've got to replace that, and you're going to replace it with somebody that doesn't have that same level of experience. Then you've got C.J. Morgan coming off an incredible knee injury. You don't know what his availability is going to be, and so when you factor all that in, and the fact that you lost a couple of safeties, the safety spot is one that is very much a concern. That's one of the reasons you go out and sign a guy like Kyle Cass is a depth guy, but also, too, that's what kind of necessitated moving Darian Jones to safety is because of a team need there. And you've got some other guys, DeCambrian and Richardson coming in, but he's a freshman, very, very talented guy. We expect him to be a guy that probably plays. He and Emmanuel Forbes probably pressed in the service as freshmen this year at corner. But there are some concerns at safety, and especially when you consider your starter is coming back off a major ACL injury, and then you lose a guy that you were expected to kind of challenge that free safety spot. So that's the big concern to me, not really corners, but at safety.
Interesting. I don't think Lukabu did them any favors at linebacker. They've had talent there for years, sometimes some pretty good depth. Walk me through what you think the starting – all right, Errol. And then what's his name? Errol, is it Brule or Brule? Steve? Oh, we lost Steve. I thought he just got mad at us and hung up. Out of bounds, ESPN 105.9. Yeah, I'm looking at the roster right now, and they don't have as many dudes as they've had the last 10 years, in my opinion. I mean, I know it was a struggle in 2016, and they went through some periods with Mullen, but this is interesting. All right, Steve, give me the top. You got Errol Thompson, and then you have what? Aaron Brule or Brule? Who else is in the mix there at linebacker?
Well, they really like Tyrus Wheat, and I think that he's a guy, too, that, that's where missing spring practice, I think, is big because this is a guy that, he kind of grew out of that safety spot at Colin into a linebacker spot, was outstanding last year. But, he really needed the benefit of spring practice. And so he's a great athlete, can really run. He'll hit you. But he's got to make up for lost time, And then, you mentioned Aaron Brule. Nathaniel Watson is a guy that they're very, very high on. They think that he's a guy that will really thrive in this system. Jed Johnson's a guy that, redshirted and set out a lot last year. And so you've got some young players, but they're largely unproven. Now, Willie Gay told me multiple times last year that the next great Mississippi State linebacker is going to be Aaron Brule. And I think when you look at this scheme, the way that Arnett wants to use those linebackers and have that guy out there that can cover and walk down to the box, Brule kind of fits that. But the depth is what worries me the most. I mean, you got Rodney Gross that's come in, has played some of this stuff, and played some at Sam at high school, and so he's somewhat familiar. But he's a high school kid, and he went through. He got here in January, but he was banged up. So even if you had spring practice, you couldn't have it. And so you've got some talent there, and you've got some numbers. But outside of Errol Thompson and a couple other guys, you don't have a ton of experience, and so that's going to be, I think, a real chore too for Arnett. It's just kind of getting those guys in a position where they know where to line up. I mean, that's going to be the most difficult part of it is these guys, have played basically, 4-2-5, and now you're going to go back and play this 3-3-5. It's just getting everybody on the same page. Where do I line up? What are my checks? What's my responsibility coverage-wise here? And so that's where you miss spring practice, is because that's where your install was. You ought to be ready to kind of ramp things up and get in the fall camp, but they're having to start with practice reps, probably in July. So you got to get these guys on the field and lay their hands on them and say, okay, listen, this is where you need to stand. That's probably the biggest problem with Arnett right now is he just hasn't had a chance to get on the field and coach his kids.
Darian Jones just posted a picture of himself in a Florida State uniform. So, and it says committed. So I guess that's a done deal too, as Steve alluded to. And that, I think he just threw that up 5 minutes ago. So Fabien Lovett, 2 Mississippi kids headed to Florida State. Steve Robertson on the Miller Lite guest line. You're listening Out of Bounds, ESPN 105.9 The Zone. Steve, as we wrap it up, I thought David Murray's Q&A with Mike Leach on your site was really good. What was your take? Did you have a takeaway on that Q&A with Leach and David Murray?
Yeah, I did. Yeah, I thought Dave did a great job. I mean, Dave, got pretty in-depth with him. And the thing that my takeaway from him, a couple things, the quarterbacks. He talked very favorably about Garrett Schrader, about how tough he was, and about how Jalen Megan's a guy that really throws strikes, and that he was familiar with him from his high school days there in Texas. And so that was big. But also, too, he mentioned, sometimes when you have guys enter the portal, those are guys you needed to lose anyway. And I thought, considering recent events, that was rather timely.
There, we'll leave it there. Steve Robertson, 247sports, genespage.com. David Murray has a Q&A with Mike Leach on the site, and it's really, really good. Steve, thanks. We'll do it later in the week. Appreciate it. Darian Jones has just tweeted out, Blake, that he's got a picture of him or somebody that looks like him and a Florida State uniform, and it says committed.
That's right.
So there you go. Jones and Lovett to FSU. I guess that's what? Marcus Woodson's down there?
I think so.
Marcus Woodson played at Ole Miss. Was at Auburn. He was a thorn in Ole Miss and Mississippi State's side at Auburn. And then he's the one that signed Derek Hall and Charles Moore. And there was somebody in that Hattiesburg area. Who was it from Oak Grove Pedal a couple of years ago? Yeah, but he's been running hard in the state of Mississippi. And then I think, Blake, and if you'll double check for me, Norvell hired Woodson at FSU. And so he left Malzahn's staff to join Mike Norvell at Free Shoes University.
Yeah, Marcus Woodson's the defensive back. You know who else is at Florida State?
Well,
with
give
Mike
me a hint.
He was just at Mississippi State, coaching a position that you talked about with Steve Robertson on defense.
Okay. So it was one of the former MSU assistants.
One of Joe Moorhead's one-year wonders.
Oh, God.
Chris Marv, formerly of Vanderbilt.
Vanderbilt guy.
Yep. That's right. He's now at Florida State.
Okay.
Coaching linebackers. So a couple SEC guys in Marv and Marcus Woodson, like you said.
Man, as good as Moorhead was at recruiting.
He hired some
and recruiting
duds.
Quarterbacks.
He hired some bad coaches.
Yeah, he hired some. As far as putting together. Now, I will give him this. I do have to give him this. He made a super hire at defensive coordinator.
Yeah.
Bob Shoop saved, I can think of 4 games. That's huge, by the way, in 2 years of football. Shoop, year 1 against A&M and Auburn, pretty darn impressive. Year 2 against Kentucky, in a year where they were real, you all know this. Ole Miss and Mississippi State could never find their identity last year. And they had to play 2 true freshmen at QB, right? Plumlee and Schrader, who, again, I love. Both. But Shoop won them the Kentucky and Ole Miss games last year, too.
Yeah.
So that's, I guess that's something to think about. But, man, Charles Huff, Lukabu, Getsy, whoever these other, Deke Adams. I mean, these weren't good hires. Live in the Bank Plus studio, the Out of Bounds Show, ESPN 105.9 The Zone, is driven by your next GMC Sierra truck. Whew, it's a great-looking ride. And GMC Yukon at Fowler Buick GMC. Tom Hudson, the owner. Locally owned and operated. FowlerBuickGMC.com. I would go there right now. I'm looking at a couple of vehicles on there. FowlerBuickGMC.com for your next pre-owned or new GMC Sierra truck. Hour number 3 coming up.